you. So, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, we are very happy, we are overwhelmed to welcome you here to share with you our common history related to slavery. We are in the only remaining slave house on the entire island, because there used to be several ones. There used to be up to 28 slave houses on the island, but there is only one left, the one we are visiting now. And it is the government of Senegal, with our first president, Mr. Senghor, who bought this place to make sure we have something that can remind us about what we went through. So it is the only one. There used to be several ones where slaves that were taken not only from Senegal, but from other West African countries were brought here before being shipped out to America, West Indies, and different places of the world. So it used to be the most important transit center in Western Africa. You may wonder why, but it is mainly due to its geographical position. Dakar, Senegal being closer to America, West Indies. Therefore, from 1536, Portuguese era, because the Portuguese have been the first European to ever set foot in Senegal, and were the first ones building slave houses on the island. So the very first ones date back from 1536. But this specific one, which has been renovated, date back by 1780s. And it was purposely shaped the way you see, because the slave traders fixed their own criteria once they bring slaves here to who is going to be where. So they had cells specifically reserved for men, cells for young girls, cells for ladies, cells for children. And the value of a man would depend upon their weight and muscle. That's why they had a weighing room, which is the one right there behind you, where only men were weighed. And the minimum weight requested for a man was 60 kg, 120 pounds. Beside that one, you have three ones behind you that were specifically reserved for men. And those cells are 2 meters 60 upon 2 meters 60. And in each of them, they would put 15 to 20 men. Can you imagine? 15 to 20. And they were almost naked, just a piece of cloth around the waist. And they would be released only once a day for them to go satisfy their needs, meaning going to toilet. Right after those ones, we had the children's one. And the curator, referring to the children's cell, would talk about the starting blocks, just to give you an idea of how they were put together in that cell. And there we used to have the highest death rate. And the value of a child would depend upon their teeth, because at that time there were no birth certificates for them. And right next to the children's cell, we have the young girl. The young girl was separated from the ladies because they were more expensive. The value of a young girl would depend upon their breasts and their virginity. And some slave traders would not hesitate having sex with them. And once they were found pregnant, they would be released either on Goree Island or in Saint Louis, which was the former capital of French Western Africa. And at 1815, during the Vienna Congress, when Saint Louis, the former capital, and Goree were given back to France, those mulattoes from white fathers and black mothers were granted French citizenship. And the curator would say that even if they did not like having that relationship with the slave traders, they would still accept it, because at least there was hope for them to be free once they were pregnant. And because of their white blood, they were privileged compared to the others. And they were called the signors. Signors that came from the word senora, that means lady. So they used to have even their own servants. And while men would go out to satisfy their needs, those young girls had their toilets within the cell. We'll have time to go around so that you can have a better idea. So right next to that one, we have the cell we call the temporary and feed room, where any slave was taken to the weighing room and wouldn't found good to go because not strong enough were brought to the temporary and feed room for them to be fattened, expecting them to be stronger enough for the next departure. But if they were still not good to go, they would not be released but used as local servants. And right facing that one, which is right there, you will see two small cells. And those ones were considered as punishment cells. Because from time to time you would see some, there's naturally some people who cannot stand injustice. But if ever they happen to rebel, they will be taken to those small cells where you cannot stand, would be like this. You will see that. You'll be just in this position. And they stay in such cells would depend upon their guiltiness. What guiltiness, how guilty, would be depending on the slave traders. And Nelson Mandela came here on 1992. And despite the refusal of the protocol, he insisted to go inside. And when he came out, he had tears on his eyes. And people said maybe he was remembering his stay in Robert Island jail. Now you have facing you the famous doorway of no return. Why did we call it the doorway of no return? Because any slave that passed the door was lost for Africa. That was bye-bye Africa. Never come back. That's what they thought. And at each side on that door, there were guards with guns. Because at any embarkment, there was some slaves trying to escape by diving. But they couldn't go any far because they were either shot by the guards or eaten by the sharks. You may wonder why sharks? Because any of them who were sick or organizing were just thrown into the ocean. Because, referring to the very bad health conditions they were living in, the first epidemic plague that took place on the island parted from here because of the very bad health conditions our ancestors were living in. So that's why, to avoid that, anytime some of them were very sick, they were just thrown into the ocean. And it's from that door of no return that Pope John Paul II, from the Vatican, when he visited on 1992, he was courageous enough to stand there and say, African people, we are sorry. Why that? Because he knew, he felt that some of the missionaries that were sent here were not saints at all. Some of them were quite involved, either or both African slave trade or colonization. And because of that, he stood there and he said, we are sorry. And while going there, you will see on each side of the door waiting rooms, because there were many of them going, but they could not all load the big ships that would not come that close because of the rocks. So they had small canoes that they would use to transfer the slaves from here to the bigger boats. So that's why they had waiting rooms. So they would have to bring a lot of big group, and some of them would have to wait on the waiting room while the others were taken there. And it was the strongest ones, the healthiest ones, that used to be taken away from their homeland. From the weighing room, they would come out. The ones found good to go would come out one by one, and they would stand here. While slave traders would be bending at the balcony, there are some people whose job was just to stand there and show how strong and healthy the slaves were for slave traders to discuss price. And the most quoted race were called the Yoruba. They were people from Benin, from Togo, from Nigeria. And because those Yoruba people were strong, they were expecting them to reproduce the same specimen. They used to call them gold slaves or stallions. And for them to live here and be shipped out to America, Brazil, West Indies, it wouldn't be through the authentic African names, it would be through numbers, just like in James. So much so that once in the next destination, they would be given their master's name. So that's why when you go to America, they have Anglo-Saxon names. When you go to Brazil, it's Portuguese names. when you go to Caribbean, French names. So meaning that it's not the African names that they were carrying. They totally lost their identity once they get there. And the slave trade lasted 3 centuries. From 1536, Portuguese era, to 1848, date of its abolition in the French colonies. But we have to point out that once Napoleon gave up with slavery, but he had a wife known as Josephine de Bornay. And Josephine de Bornay was a girl from Martinique. And she was a plantation owner. Therefore, she urged Napoleon to start again with slavery. But unfortunately for her, she was divorced by Napoleon on 1809. And on behalf of our ancestors, we say well done for her. We have the big cell right here that used to be the ladies' one. I told you they were separated from young girls because young girls were more expensive. Nevertheless, they were submitted to the same discipline than men. And we had some emancipated slaves that were engaged to do the job. And for them to make sure that the boss was happy, they would be even harder towards their own sisters. We can understand. It's not because they meant to, but because they were afraid to return to their former condition. So slave trade lasted 3 centuries. And within that frame time, it's been reported that about 15 to 20 million were taken away. And among them, even though the number is controversial, among them about 6 million died by privation and by treatment. And as you know, they used to overload the boat in order to have the greatest number upon arrival. Those boats used to be 30 meters long, 8 meters large, and they would put 250 to 300 slaves. So within 300 years, can you imagine? Separating mother from their child, separating husband from their wives, separating brothers from their sisters, not only here, but also when sending them away. They would go to different destinations, so it was total separation. And while all that was happening, the slave traders used to be living upstairs. They had their kitchen, they had their toilets, it was a good life. So very oftenly the creator would say, I wonder how come they could live peacefully upstairs with all that was happening downstairs. We'll let you think of that. So that's why our authorities managed to keep this house, so that everybody, mainly us, be aware of what took place here. But also hoping that other people from around the world also learn and know about this. And know that we are big people. That's why we can forget, but we can never forget. We can forgive, but we can never forget. So that's why this place is to call the world for reconciliation based on mutual respect. Because as we said it yesterday, no matter what, we have our pride, we have our dignity, and we won't let anybody step on our toe. So we can welcome everybody, but we need people to know who we are. And for that to happen, we need to know who we are, so that we can tell and show others who we are and get the respect that we deserve. Therefore,
how did they get here?